are soft, like avocados. This is Natividad. She's 80. She is not soft. When one father threatened her with his machete, she stood her ground. I had been trained, she told me. I wasn't afraid. I accompanied these grandmothers out to the villages where they used games to teach that good parenting includes smiles and laughing and talking and hugging and listening. Several grandmothers who do this work, not surprisingly, are themselves the victims of domestic violence. And one of them said to me, even if somebody kills me for doing this work, I will do it. Grandmothers are battling against human rights abuse in Israel. Every day, 70 to 100,000 Palestinians go through the military checkpoints to get to schools, to get to jobs, to get to doctor's appointments. When they get to the booths where the soldiers check their credentials, they are often detained for hours and hours without explanation. I don't know, I should say, I don't know of an army in the world that is not trained to maintain power and control somehow, and this is a strategy for doing that. However, the Israeli Jewish grandmothers found that completely unacceptable, and I'll tell you why. Between 2000 and 2006, 68 women gave birth while they were trapped at checkpoints. 35 of them miscarried and 5 of them died at the checkpoints. Between 2001 and 2004, 991 Palestinians were denied medical access. 83 died while they were trapped at the checkpoints. So 2 by 2, 400 Jewish Israeli grandmothers are now still monitoring the checkpoints throughout the West Bank. And they've done that since 2002, the Second Intifada. They document farmers' products that are rotting because they can't get them to market. They document students who can't take their final exams because they can't get to class. They document bridegrooms who can't get to their own weddings. The grandmothers issue daily reports of abuse on the internet, to the Knesset, and to journalists. They've actually won grudging respect from the Israel Defense Forces. Their spokesman just told journalists, we've learned some things, we can do better. Today, the IDF soldiers are trained to use respectful behavior. Trained doesn't mean they do it, but they are trained now. To use respectful behavior when they're dealing with the Palestinians. Some checkpoints, not all, have water and shade and bathrooms and a place where Muslims can spread their prayer rugs if they're there during times to pray. The grandmothers are part of an NGO called Machzam Watch. It means Checkpoint Watch. Like observant Jews everywhere, they teach their grandchildren to fight prejudice and injustice and to treat other people the way they would like to be treated themselves. Hannah Barak took me to checkpoints all over the West Bank. The work these grandmothers do, as you can imagine, is extremely controversial. The soldiers in their own families don't support it. It causes huge rifts within the families. And yet, these Israeli grandmothers have just won the highest award given in their country by the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. Grandmothers are working against illiteracy in Argentina. This is a story that's in the exhibit, as is the story about the Indian grandmothers, for example. Even in a world where people read on Kindles and iPads, many children are still illiterate. That's especially true in Argentina, surprisingly, because Argentina had the highest literacy rate of any country in Latin America. However, between 1976 and 83, the military dictatorship looted libraries, burned newspaper offices, killed journalists, killed authors, killed intellectuals, and people were terrified to read. Years later, hoping to reinitiate children's interest in books and reading, the Memo Giardinelli Foundation began inviting grandmothers who remembered how to read aloud to children. The grandmothers inspired so many children to want to learn to read and to go to school that their program, the Storytelling Grandmothers, has been incorporated into the national school curriculum in Argentina and has been copied by 7 other countries, including Spain. Today, the Storytelling Grandmother program in Argentina includes Grandmothers are fighting for justice in the Philippines. This story is also in the exhibit. During World War II, this church in Manila was a brothel. The Japanese army kidnapped an adolescent girl to provide sex to every 100 soldiers. 30 garrisons in the Philippines doubled as comfort stations where sex slaves were imprisoned between 1942 and 1945 to serve as many as 10 men a night. For 50 years, the comfort women hid their shameful histories, even from their own families, from their husbands and from their children. And then a woman named Maria Rosa Henson told her story on Manila television. It was unspeakable. This was a silenced subject. And she invited the comfort women to come forward and with her fight for their rights. The grandmothers transformed their shame into political action. And in 1993, they filed a class action suit against the Japanese government. They asked for reparations, they asked for a formal apology, and they asked for a place in history books so their experience would never be repeated. After 10 years, the Japanese Supreme Court rejected the case. They didn't give up. Most of them are now in their 80s and 90s, but they demonstrate in the streets, they speak at universities, they collect signatures on petitions, and sometimes they dance in the afternoon in their bungalows and sing karaoke. Their bungalow was, by the way, purchased for them by sympathetic Japanese citizens. Their fight will not end when they die. Says Narcisa, she told me that they are building international support now to keep women and girls everywhere safe from sexual violence. It's crucial, she told me. Everyone, the whole world must fight for the next generation. Grandmothers are fighting environmental degradation in Thailand. When Thangkabai Pangtawang works at her loom, she looks through those warp threads at a mountain. She knows that just on the other side of that mountain, a gold mining company is mining for gold. This story is also in the exhibit. On the other side of that mountain, rivers are contaminated with dangerous levels of arsenic, lead, manganese, cadmium. When the locals had blood tests, 63% of the samples contained arsenic, 100% of the samples contained mercury and lead. Thangkabai's grandmother group, which raises cotton, organic cotton, and dyes it and spins it and weaves it, voted unanimously to donate some of the money that they made from selling their textiles to the neighboring villagers who now had to buy food and water. They never had to do that before. The women also traveled from Loi province, which is in the northeastern part of Thailand, to Bangkok to talk with government officials. And they cited what I thought was a uniquely Buddhist argument based on the interconnectedness of elected officials and their constituents. I just heard that the Thai government has refused to renew the mining company's lease. I'm not sure that that's true yet. I hope it is, because I hope that the children will continue to wear the organic cotton jackets that their grandmothers make for them. Grandmothers are raging against political disaffection in the United States. Are there any of you know raging grannies? Well, a complacent public results in a flaccid democracy, we know that. That's why the raging grannies don flowery hats and dowdy aprons and write witty songs and stage playful protests, all to gain media attention for the issues that they think will be good or bad for their grandchildren. There are 60 granny gaggles in 5 countries. I documented the San Francisco Raging Grannies Action League. Granny Gaggle writes their lyrics. She continues to agitate after 2 hip replacements. She rides around on her disability scooter. Ruth Robertson has a collection of, don't tell her I said this, frumpy hats and pins in her upstairs hall. She tells potential members you don't even have to be a grandmother in order to belong. You just have to be a woman who's willing to wear a funny hat. All over the world, when I mentioned grandchildren, grandmothers grabbed their pictures to show me their grandchildren. And Barbara Berman told me that when her 10-year-old granddaughter comes to visit, they climb up on the roof of her cottage and pick persimmons off the tree. I thought, grandmothers may rage, but they have big hearts. Indigenous grandmothers are praying for peace and for the earth. An optimistic shared prophecy connects many Indigenous groups. It promises that women from the four directions, oops, too fast, women from the four directions will awaken the world. The International Council of 13 Indigenous grandmothers, all are healers and shamans, hold public meetings every 6 months where they, using their own traditions, pray for peace and pray to heal the environment. I interviewed and photographed them in Sedona, Arizona. Jody first convened the grandmothers in 2004. The 13 Indigenous grandmothers have actually prayed at St. Peter's in Rome. They've had an audience with the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, India. They've helped get water issues on the United Nations agenda. They helped preserve sacred sites around the world. And they have represented Indigenous voices in many international summits. Their commitment statement says, "We believe the wisdom of our ancestors will guide us through an uncertain future." This is one of the stories in the exhibit. Grandmothers demand justice in Argentina. Military and police officers tortured and murdered some 30,000 people during the military dictatorship I was talking about earlier in Argentina. And then they stole their victims' infants and toddlers. Ever since, the children's grandmothers have searched. They pretended to be maids to get into houses where they heard their grandchildren might be living. They pretended to sit in the park knitting, whereas in fact they were planning their next moves. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, it's not the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, you may have heard of them. The grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo commissioned an American geneticist to develop a test, it's the equivalent of a paternity test, to prove that grandmothers were related to the grandchildren whom they had never met because they were born in the detention camps. Elsa de Aguilar's granddaughter, Pabla Logares, was the first grandchild to be identified by genetic testing, and there have since been 105 others. But it's not enough. There were 400 or 500 children who were abducted, and the grandmother search continues. Grandmothers are recapturing traditions in Peru. In many cultures, grandmothers sustain traditions. In Peru, they saved one. Traditional Inca weaving patterns and dyeing processes had been completely lost by the 1970s. No one was wearing traditional clothing. The ancestors, they believed, had been betrayed. Nilda Calanyapa started the Center for Traditional Textiles of Cusco to bring back traditional weaving. She told me only the grandmothers knew the vocabulary, the meaning of the patterns, and the technical information about the dyes and looms. She arranged for local high school students to get academic credit for interviewing their grandmothers about their grandmothers' weaving, know how to do a gratitude dance? Maybe when I come back in September, I'll teach you how to do a gratitude dance. They are grateful for more than money, though. Joanne O'Shea, who's wearing the red jacket here, said, when you get to Swaziland and South Africa, which is where I was going next, tell them what a gift they are to us. We think about them every day. For us, every day, she said, is Thanksgiving. So finally, the grandmothers in South Africa. Although Swaziland has the highest rate of AIDS in the world, South Africa has the most infected people, 5.6 million. Grandmothers Against Poverty and Aid, GAPA for short, is an NGO in Khayelitsha Township near Cape Town, where gangs and crime are rampant. This story is also in the exhibit. GAPA is a Stephen Lewis Foundation grantee. It's run by grandmothers for grandmothers. 80% of all GAPA grandmothers care for children who have been orphaned by AIDS. 30% of them care for another family member who is HIV positive, and 15% of them are HIV positive themselves. It made me so sad to think about what these women's lives must be like, that when I asked the first one, how are you doing? The last thing I expected to hear was, I feel strong. I will tell you something. These big women can do more to help each other than any outsider ever could. GAPA Grandmothers, for example, started an after-school program for the children. It's the only one in Khayelitsha. When school gets out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 135 little kids come hungry for lunch, which of course the grandmothers have been cooking all morning. The children climb all over play equipment, which was purchased, by the way, with money from Canada, laughing and shouting. The grandmothers teach each other craft skills so that they can earn enough money to feed and educate the children. This is Rita. Rita learned how to make hats. Rita said to me, people call me Hats Mama. There is bread in the house. There are eggs in the house. Hats were the end of poverty in my house. I've got something in my purse. I've got power. Which brings me to the subject of grandmother power. Grandmother power. Why is it happening right now? There are more grandmothers on the planet than there have been in the history of the world. In the United States, there are 42 million. They are younger than they've ever been. Half of them, half in the U.S., are between the ages of 45 and 64. So they are not only younger, they are healthier than they have ever been. Many of them, particularly in the global north, have professional experience, just as we all do. And because the boomers are now becoming grandmothers at the rate of 4,000 a day in the U.S., they know that they can change the world because they came of age in the 1960s and they did it. So, like the women all over the world, look and say, evaluating this troubled place we live in, it's just